Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Kahn, and today we're recording a follow-up of episode 59, which we released in December. That episode was entitled, Will I Marry the Wrong Person? And today we're going to address the obvious follow-up, Did I marry the wrong person? We'll get to that in a moment. First, check out the website intimatejudaism.com for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcast, rate and review, and please leave a comment. We're working on additional projects as well so that Intimate Judaism can expand our reach further. So please help us by telling people about Intimate Judaism and share this podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience.
This is an episode that I'd like to talk about with as much sensitivity as we can, because there are going to be many listeners who really relate to this idea of being stuck in a marriage where they're unsatisfied or unhappy. But I want to start out by saying that the question, did I marry the wrong person, is actually a very common one. It's a very normal one. And throughout marriage, people ask themselves that question, not necessarily on a regular basis, but once in a while. We received a letter from a listener that I think really exemplifies what can happen to people in a marriage and how important it is to discuss situations of people being in marriages where they're not necessarily that happy and how to navigate it and what to do about it.
Let me read that letter. I think it serves as a really good framing device for this conversation. So here's what our listener wrote. Thank you for your podcast. It's been a great help in my life. Given the fact and how much I appreciate what you do, it pains me to say that I was a little disappointed when I saw that your last episode was not, Did I Marry the Wrong Person? I was looking forward to it all month, and I'm disheartened that I will have to wait yet another month at least to listen. Of course, I'm not delusional enough to think that listening to one podcast will solve all my problems, but I was looking forward to being seen and addressed. After years of marriage, I am completely convinced that I married the wrong man. As a matter of fact, I realized it about 3 months into the marriage, but I was hoping things would get better. Now that we have 2 children together, whom I love more than anything in the world and would do anything for, including being miserable for the rest of my life, leaving is not really an option. Additionally, for various reasons, it would likely affect my profession, and I would have to start over from scratch. I don't think I would end up in a better place at the end of the story, so I'm sticking it out. It's really hard. Sometimes I really hate my life. I've spoken to a therapist at length about this issue, but other than sympathy and some coping strategies, they are not really able to help me much more than that. This is my lot in life. Some people deal with physical health issues, loss of loved ones, or other hardships. I have accepted that this is mine. It sucks, but it is what it is. It's a very, very painful letter to read, Talli, both the resignation that there's no way to fix the situation as well as the situation itself.
It is painful, and it also indicates to us the work that we do on this podcast really impacts people. And so we apologize for having had to wait for this episode. I also want to acknowledge how incredibly difficult your situation sounds, because when you feel trapped in a marriage that you regret, but you also deeply love your children and want to prioritize their well-being, it's an enormous weight to carry emotionally. It's also burdensome. And so the way that you describe your reality, that you accept it as your lot in life, it's actually quite heartbreaking to hear that. And it also, in a way, speaks to your resilience. You're making daily sacrifices out of love for your children, a feeling of duty, and that's really commendable. But there's also a lot of pain that you're in. And I think this is a good opportunity to discuss ways that you can cope. And hopefully other listeners to this podcast will gain some tools for dealing with situations where they don't feel happy or satisfied in their marriages. There are several points that I would like to make about your letter, but before we do that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Scott. Is there some kind of Jewish concept of marrying the right person or the wrong person? Let's start with some texts, and then we can talk about different philosophies of love and marriage, romantic love and happiness in marriage.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea, Talli. I would say that Jewish sources are not univocal. There certainly are different opinions, but as a general approach, it seems that the Gemara has a particular way of looking at this concept, which is often known colloquially as bashert, the destined person. I'm going to read a translation. It's my own free translation from Sota Daf Bet Amud Aleph, page 2a. Here's what it says there. Reish Lakish would say, a man is not coupled with a woman except according to his deeds. Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who, by the way, was also Reish Lakish's brother-in-law and Chavruta, so it's the same school of thought, so to speak, it is as difficult to match them as the parting of the Red Sea. But is this really true? Didn't Rav Yehuda say in the name of Rav, 40 days before the formation of the embryo, a heavenly voice echoes and says, the daughter of so-and-so will marry so-and-so, and that implies that it's destined, it's not based on somebody's deeds. There is no contradiction. The latter source is talking about Zivug Rishon, the first marriage, and the first source that ascribes one's spouse to one's deeds is talking about a second marriage. So the Gemara certainly understands that there is a concept of a destiny, that a person is destined to marry a particular person, and it also says in the event that the person actually has a second marriage, that's not destined. Let me read a second source, which is really working along the same lines. This is from Breshit Rabbah, Samachet, 68. Again, my free translation. A noblewoman asked Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, from after creation until now, what has God been doing? He answered her, he is sitting and matchmaking. She said to him, that's God's job? I can do that. I have several slaves and I have several maidservants, and I can pair them in an instant. He said to her, if it appears simple in your eyes, before the Holy One, it is as difficult as the parting of the Red Sea. Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta went on his way. What did she do? She took 1,000 slaves and 1,000 maidservants and placed them in lines, saying, so-and-so will marry this one, and so-and-so will marry this one. She matched them all in one night. The next day, they came to her. This one, his head was wounded. This one, his eye was gouged. This one, his leg was broken. She asked them, what do you want? And each one said, I don't want this one. And that one said, I don't want this one. Immediately, she sent and brought Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta and said to him, there is no God like your God. Your Torah is true. It is beautiful and praiseworthy. You spoke well. He said to her, is that not what I said to you? It appears simple in your eyes, but before God, it is as difficult as the parting of the Red Sea. Let me just read one more line here, which I think is a fascinating ending to it. What does the Holy One, blessed be He, do for them? He matches them against their will, not to their liking. As it is stated, God settles the individuals in a home, liberates prisoners in chains. What does it mean, chains? And this is a play on words with the word bakosharot. It is with weeping and with song. One who is willing with song. One who is unwilling weeps. This source doesn't necessarily say that this is talking about the first or second marriage. This is one that says it's based on God's decision-making. He'll decide that some people go together, and it could be that the people will be unhappy together. That's what the last line of the Midrash says. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the wrong person. Nevertheless, God says some of them are going to be happy, and some of them will be weeping, which is a fascinating idea. Now, of course, we could put this Midrash together with the Gemara read before and say this is only referring to the second marriage, but we don't necessarily have to do this. This could be a different school of thought that says it's not destined. I just thought this is an interesting way of framing it from our sources, saying that there is a concept of destiny. There is a concept of God matches people together based on their deeds, but it could also be a concept of God matches people together, saying that these people belong together, and even if they're unhappy together, and I'm not sure what you, Talli, will say as a therapist, even if they're unhappy together, that doesn't necessarily mean they married the wrong person. Maybe there's some other goal that's supposed to come out of that. Obviously, we're not God, but this Midrash certainly seems to say that God will marry people together and says this is the right match, even if they're not always so happy. Now, of course, as we will see later on, we're not going to talk about that now, Torah and the Gemara has a whole Masechet called Masechet Gittin, which is about divorce. Divorce is allowed and sometimes mandated in Jewish law. So it's not as though we say you're destined to stay together with someone with whom you're unhappy, but there is an idea that happiness isn't necessarily the only factor in determining whether this was the right person or the wrong person.
Your text highlights the importance of divine intervention in marriages, and that the person that is picked for you is not necessarily going to be the person who you're going to be happy with. And we can talk about what it means to be happy with a person. But what's so interesting about the text you brought is that I'm going to actually compare it to a more contemporary philosophical approach that says almost something that's the same, which is that you will not marry the right person or the person who is going to make you happy. This is based on Alain de Botton, who founded the School of Life. And his philosophy is that the reason why you're going to marry the wrong person is because you will associate love with how you were loved. And how you were loved growing up is mixed together with a lot of different painful aspects of development. And so if you were loved in a way in which you also had to soothe your parents or calm them down so that they would love you, you're likely going to choose something that feels familiar to you. And so, according to de Botton, what we seek when we fall in love or what we seek when we commit to a partner is not happiness. We seek familiarity. So, when we seek familiarity, we're actually going to be unhappy because it recreates in our adult relationships the unhappiness and what we were deprived of as children.
Why do we necessarily assume that we all had unhappy childhoods? Why can't familiarity lead to happiness or at least to satisfaction if a person doesn't see his childhood as inherently painful?
We don't all see our childhoods as painful, but we all have aspects of childhood which have painful feelings associated with them. We are, even in the best of situations, nurtured and we have our needs met and attended to, and we have feelings of love and feelings of tenderness and caring and empathy, but no child will never feel frustrated. Every child wants a cookie that they can't have. No child will never feel sad. No child will never feel pain. We will have all those negative feelings as well. Those negative feelings are associated with love the same way the positive feelings can be associated with love. In fact, before we even learned to speak in psychoanalytic theory, Melanie Klein talked about loving your primary object and also seeing them as all good, but then also seeing them as all bad when they don't do what you want them to do. And you're not really integrating them as one person. You actually see them as two separate people until about, I don't know exactly what age, where you realize that this is sad, unavailable mommy, and this is happy, available mommy. And the other thing about childhood is that we talk about the good enough concept. We don't have to have a brilliant, wonderful, perfect childhood. None of us have that. And we don't have terrible parents, but nobody has perfect parents, and we're not perfect parents, but we do need to be good enough. And I think this concept can also be brought onto marriage. In other words, part of why there is a lot of dissatisfaction in marriage is that often the concept of marriage is over idealized, or the beliefs about romantic love that we're going to be able to get married to somebody who's going to know us so well that we never have to communicate to them what we're actually feeling. They'll just know. And when there is an over-idealized and overly romantic belief in the idealism of marriage and the living happily ever after, then there is going to be disappointment because that never happens. Life happens, and with life are very stressful events, and there are times when we cannot be there for one another. And it's really about knowing how to adapt to the fact that your partner will have flaws. Often they have flaws that you knew about going in. And by the way, you have flaws. Knowing that you have flaws as well is going to almost ensure that we will have moments in marriage that we are not happy. The question then has to do with the frequency of that unhappiness or the core of the marriage being unhappy. But, feeling kind of disillusioned or feeling kind of like, wait a second, did I do the right thing here, is actually like a normal stage in marriage. According to Alain de Botton, he calls it a blessing in disguise because it can replace the idea of this idealized, romanticized love with a real, more mature love. And that requires a lot of acceptance, accepting the frustration of living with another person who's not perfect, who leaves their stuff on the floor, who snores, who, may not always give you the attention that you want and need. So the question really isn't so much about, did I marry the wrong person? The question is really about, how can I make this the right marriage?
Based on this theory that you just mentioned from de Botton, what is the difference between a marriage going through an acceptable and predictable rough patch versus a marriage that's struggling and divorce should be considered, or at least maybe going for therapy. In other words, if this is part of marriage and even, as he says, a blessing in disguise, what's the difference between a marriage that is a good marriage and a marriage that is on the rocks?
Well, the main difference is that marriage, like anything else, like any other developmental process or journey, has to be worked on. Like we work on things, we invest in things, we develop them, we improve them. And so if both partners or even one partner has kind of checked out and is unwilling to engage, if there's emotional or physical abuse or neglect, if there's chronic resentment, if there's chronic contempt, if there's a extreme power imbalance, if there's a absence of your basic foundation of respect or kindness, if there's a lack of safety, there are definitely reasons that are totally legitimate and even you should get out under those circumstances. So we have to acknowledge the difference between the ability to repair. Repair, by the way, I've talked about this before, it's kind of an ongoing process of rupture and repair in marriages, or when there's just absolutely no way to make it work.
Okay, Talli, let's go back to our letter and our letter writer who feels that she's really stuck in this marriage and she's also not going anywhere, even though she wishes that she could. This is a broad question, but what would you say that someone in that situation should do? Where do they start?
So let's acknowledge, first of all, that I believe the letter writer said she'd been to therapy. And first of all, this is a good place to say therapy doesn't always help. But I'm a very big believer in couples therapy. I do a lot of couples therapy. And there are situations where people are just miserable in their marriages. And yet there's still a lot that can be done, particularly when a couple chooses to stay together. I'm intentionally using the word choose because I believe the letter writer indicated that she has no option but to stay married. And that's often how people frame their kind of stuck place. So the first thing I want to acknowledge here is that there are options. There are options. And instead of saying, I'm stuck, instead of saying, I have no option, I would change it to, well, actually, I have the option to divorce because divorce is always an option, but we're choosing not to. We're choosing to stay together. We're making this decision and we're making it maybe for financial reasons or because of the children, but we have to acknowledge that it is a choice. We're making the choice to stay.
In other words, if I can just paraphrase that, what you're saying is that just because you're doing it for external reasons like my job won't allow me to get divorced or I can't do it for the kids, that doesn't mean it's not a choice.
It's still a choice, exactly. And you can still work on trying to make the relationship improve as much as possible. I could talk about that in a minute. You could also work on finding meaning and fulfillment in your life with the small joys that you can have in marriage. Perhaps you're not going to be soulmates, quote unquote, but can you have something together? Can you make it work as co-parents? Can you make it work even maybe you both have a sense of humor so you can go to a stand-up comedy club together once a month or do something to recognize that there is an attachment, even though it's not what you would want, or it's not really what fulfills you, or you wish you did not have to be with that person. But what can you make out of it that you haven't yet thought about? What can you control? What do you have autonomy to change within the marriage where you feel stuck? What you want to do is kind of focus not just on the other person and their faults, but you also want to focus on the dynamic in the marriage. What do I notice about the more, the more? The more I do this, the more she does that. And try to work even from your own place on being able to change that dynamic through the way that you react with your partner, the way that you treat your partner. The Gottmans, who are well-known couples therapists who did a lot of research, they talk a lot about, predictors for divorce and how to have a successful relationship. And predictors of divorce called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Have you heard of that, Scott? To me, I feel like everyone knows this stuff, but that's because that's
No, I mean, I've heard of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but not in the context of divorce.
right. So those are, according to the Gottmans, criticism and not just complaining, but like ego assassination. Contempt, where you express disdain or disrespect, you roll your eyes, you're often sarcastic, being very defensive all the time. You can't take any kind of feedback or criticism. You're constantly on the defensive. And stonewalling, which is an emotional shutdown and a disconnect. It's really emotionally abandoning to your partner. They also talk about having more negative interactions than positive ones and not trying to repair. And also getting flooded. And, just when you get flooded, I have a person I work with who calls them tear down sessions. Every once in a while, his wife would just throw everything at him, including the kitchen sink, like everything that he does wrong. And these tear down sessions would last for a very long time. If there's just no communication or attempt to talk about what's going on, or there's emotional disengagement. So these are all predictors for an unsuccessful relationship and likely divorce. And so his takeaways, Gottman talks about, building a culture of doing what you can to appreciate and respect what is there, expressing gratitude, acknowledging the positive qualities in your partner, creating shared meaning whenever you can, when you can share a moment together and acknowledge it. We just had a good time today. We did something together and it was actually nice. We got along. And that's a good thing. And that's a good thing for the kids also to see, because staying together for the kids isn't helpful if every day you're having hostile fights and the kids are seeing that. Staying together for the kids is only reasonable if you're providing them with a stable environment.
So the four horsemen of the divorce apocalypse are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Is that right? Those are
Yeah,
our four?
according to Gottman. Yeah.
Tell me if I'm right about this. Based on that idea, I'm getting back to this thing we keep saying, the wrong person, and whether such a concept is even real. Even if we say that you're destined to marry somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be happy. So that really isn't relevant to this. Let's not deal with metaphysics right now. On a practical level, it almost sounds like, and I'd like you to tell me if I'm right or wrong, that it's not so much about marrying the right or wrong person. It's a matter of how you're dealing with it. Meaning the predictors of divorce are not based on who the person is, but based on the way people choose to interact with each other. That doesn't mean people are necessarily going to be happy otherwise, but it does mean that these will certainly make it worse and make it more likely that the marriage will fail if you're doing these activities. But criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling are not fundamental character traits. They're choices of how do we interact with each other.
Exactly. They're not even necessarily thought out choices. They're actually almost reflexive reactions, which
But
are
one can choose not to do them if one's cognizant of it.
exactly. And that's exactly the point, because how you choose to navigate your relationship will often very much predict having a better relationship. But here's the thing, these things kind of draw on each other. What happens is that you're in a marriage and you don't feel like you're getting your needs met, and there's conflict and there isn't resolution, and you're sad and you're frustrated. And often the way you react is going to be with hostility and with anger, and that is going to create a spiral of conflict and even more detachment from one another and disconnection. And so, what we can do is choose to accept that we are maybe not going to get certain needs met from our partner, either because our partner is limited in that way or because of the way that we interact with them is just not working to get those moments of attachment and connection working. And so, what I talk about is kind of changing your anger to sadness and maybe even grief. In other words, there's an acceptance process when you have chosen to stay in a marriage which does not feel good to you, does not feel like you're attached. You don't have that deep connection. It's hard to be vulnerable with that person. And again, I think that you want to try whatever you can to do in some sort of couples therapy setting if possible. And as the writer indicated, therapy doesn't always work. She did not say if she went to couples therapy, she said she went to individual therapy. But still, what we want to do is be able to shift our focus from the idealism of marriage. I wish, if only I had that soulmate who got me, who could just look in my eyes and know exactly what I'm feeling and be able to preempt and predict what I need, because that's not happening. But can I shift that? First of all, I may need to mourn for the loss of having what I would want in my marriage. And that, by the way, happens not necessarily because your partner is a bad guy or a bad woman, a bad person. There are all sorts of reasons why we need to mourn losses in life. There may be chronic illnesses, there may be disabilities, there all sorts of things. And so the realization that there might be limitations about your partner, or your partner may be now like hooked on drugs, and that's also a big problem in marriages when there's substance abuse. We could do a whole episode on that. But when you've decided to stay in a less than optimal marriage, you want to shift the focus to how do we coexist? How do we lower our expectations? We are not going to be romantic, passionate lovers, or we're not going to be soulmates, and we're not going to have this shared intimacy with each other. We don't have that. Maybe we never had it. Or maybe we had it, but there was a crisis and we've never been able to rebuild it. But what is the workable middle ground? Can we be teammates? Can we be partners? Can we interact with each other, even if it's not with a deep sense of love? Can we interact with each other with respect, with cooperation? And can we do it in a way that can feel doable in our lives?
I'd like to actually bring a text, if it's okay, that I think might relate to that idea, the marriage of Yaakov with Leah, and then the marriage of Yaakov with her sister Rachel. The marriage with Leah started off, and we can see this in Leah's naming of her children. The first three children, she named them names which indicates her despair. Now my husband will love me. Maybe at this point he'll accompany me because I've borne him three children. And by the fourth child, she says, this time I'm going to thank God. And perhaps, I don't know if this is the literal understanding or perhaps I'm reading a bit into it, but that's the resignation and acceptance that it's not going to be the soulmate relationship that I always wanted, but it can still be something. Meaning once I get rid of my idealistic understanding of what the marriage should be, of what I was hoping was going to be, I can now say maybe I can work with what it actually is and try to make the best of that particular situation. And I want to add to that another idea about his relationship with Rachel, his preferred wife. And obviously we're not talking about people with two wives here at the same time. That's not a situation which we're dealing with, but as a paradigmatic example of an imperfect marriage and eventually learning how to contend with it and make the most out of it with Yaakov and Leah. With Yaakov and Rachel is the other side of it, which is the, so to speak, perfect marriage. In that situation, we talk about this idealistic marriage, the marriage where you're soulmates, as you say, you look into each other's eyes and just know what you're thinking. I find it fascinating that if we think of Yaakov and Rachel as that kind of marriage, the first interaction they have after they're married that we actually see written in the Torah is Yaakov getting angry at Rachel. That's the first time we see them communicating once they're already married. I think it's fascinating that people look at marriages, these ideal marriage, oh, they have everything perfect. In the perfect marriage in the Torah, so to speak, with Yaakov and Rachel, the first interaction they have together is anger at each other and frustration with each other. Maybe this idealization of these couples might be a problem sometimes, and this is what I'm asking you, if we look at a couple that's the perfect couple, maybe we're idealizing something which isn't actually really like that. And part of our problem might be sometimes assuming that there is something which is achievable and some people have achieved it, and maybe it's just an unrealistic expectation.
I also think that for couples who feel like there's not a sense of getting along, that there's a lot of conflict, that they're not in a good marriage, they often feel like they're the only ones, that all these other couples are having an idealistic, perfect, wonderful time together. And I would also say on the flip side, you might see couples who are constantly bickering and you think they don't really get along very well when they're actually really very well connected. So we don't really know what goes on for other people. People have different types of marriages, and some marriages, especially avoidant ones, which are avoidant of conflict and avoidant of dealing with any of the tough stuff, may appear on the surface level to be a great marriage because it's a quiet one, but each person is really into their own process and not really connecting on a deep level.
Sometimes I've seen people bicker and I say half jokingly, that's just how they say I love you.
Right. If it works for them, then that's great.
Okay, now you've mentioned a lot of ideas of how a struggling marriage can improve. Maybe we can summarize it a little bit now, give some practical steps for people who've been listening and with like a little summary of what are some practical things I can do in my struggling, perhaps unhappy marriage so that I can make the best of it or that we can make the best of it or maybe even make it improve.
Yeah, I think it's great that you said that I can do, because beyond couples therapy or beyond the wish that my partner will change, I think I've said this before, you have two choices. You can choose to leave the marriage, or you can choose to try and make it work with the tools that you have. Curtain number three is that my partner change, and you don't have control over that. So I like the way you asked that. So, first of all, making small changes can create big shifts, even in the way you relate to your spouse. You don't have to fall into the trap of reacting in ways that you've been reacting because of how you've been triggered. You can work on your own ways of reacting. Couples go into these spirals, these dynamics where you can almost predict them. You can see them happening. The one partner will say one thing, the other one will say that's not true, and they'll defend, and the whole pattern starts. But learning how to take a minute, listen to what your partner's saying, and without reacting, but rather responding to it in a calm way, can change very much the way your partner will then respond back to you. So being able to respond with mirroring, with listening, with validating, trying to rebuild some sense of respect for the person, even though you don't feel love for that person, making boundaries, like giving up on trying to change them. Let's say there are some changes that have occurred in religious level. We have a whole episode on that. So give up on trying to get them to daven, let's say, like, or get them to go to shul. Don't try to change them because, you need to make those boundaries and let them have their independence in the way they want to live their life as long as it doesn't affect you. Give yourself the ability to give independence. And most importantly, don't believe or try to get all of your needs met from one person. Both Alain de Botton and also Esther Perel talks about this, the idea of people thinking that when they get married, they are taking on a best friend, co-parent, a partner, a chavruta, something for everything. And no, we don't. We have other people in our lives, and we have to be able to outsource and resource other people in our lives to fill needs in our lives. Self-care, doing things with your friends, doing things that you enjoy, not making your marriage necessarily be the only thing in your life, because there's a lot of other things in your life. What gives you meaning? What can you invest in more? Friendships, learning, hobbies, spirituality, personal growth. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can focus on rather than constantly trying to get your partner to change so that you can be happier with them.
Before we move forward, Talli, I'd like to ask one more question about those four horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, because it relates to what you just said. Because contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling are all attitudinal. These are ways of interacting. Criticism is actually a thing you do. It's not so much the way you do it, but you tell someone, I don't like it when you do the following, or it hurts when you do the following. So where is there room for criticism? Because even though, as you said, curtain number three, you can't change your partner, but even in healthy marriages, there are things that partners would prefer
Absolutely.
that someone does differently. There has to be some room for telling them this bothers me. Is that considered criticism?
Look, you can talk to John Gottman, but you can ask him that question. I happen to think that there is times that constructive criticism is in place because when you're in when you're in a partnership that's meaningful, you change your partner and your partner changes you. You help each other become better people. And so criticism, when it's delivered in a useful, constructive way.
Not throwing the kitchen sink, in other words, as you
Yeah,
said before.
exactly. That's what he's really referring to. And he's also referring to ego assassination, which is not, you left the dishes in the sink, but you never listened to me. You are incredibly selfish. Okay, those are the criticisms that he's referring to. It's ego assassination. It's really making the person feel shamed for who they are rather than it's not talking about what they did or didn't do. And the other thing is that we generally don't respond well to criticism. We become defensive. And so we want to be able to be very intentional about how we deliver feedback to our partners, but delivering that feedback in a way which is respectful and caring. I would love to say loving if that's part of what's going on. That's usually accepted.
Okay, that makes sense.
In the previous episode, when we talked about will you marry the wrong person, we were talking about the fact that there is a lot of pressure in the frum communities to marry young, often only after a few dates when you don't really know each other. And I spoke about the triangle of love, where there's passion and then intimacy and then commitment. And sometimes in our frum circles, there hasn't really been a move towards either passion or intimacy. It's more like, can I make a commitment to this person? And what are the potential pitfalls for that? And, I was talking about a couple where she was told that she has a special zchut for marrying the first person she meets. And I might have disparaged the marriage when in fact, this is a marriage where both partners worked really, really hard to make it work, and it works. And maybe it's not the best marriage in the world in terms of each person getting their needs met the way that they would want to have them met. But with very hard work and intention, and often therapy and mindfulness meaning really doing things with intent and thinking about what you're doing, you can make a marriage work. And you could actually learn to appreciate parts of your partner. And what I have also seen is that the marriage can get better. Also, this is another Esther Perel thing. She says, we marry 3 times in our lives, and sometimes it's to the same person. So what I want to say by that is I will often work with people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, and they will talk about their parents' marriage. I often ask about people's parents' marriages. And often I'll hear people say, when I was growing up, I just thought they should just get divorced already. They fought so much, and I thought that they did. And here they are now in their 60s and their 70s and their 80s, and they love each other. They're not the same that they were when we were growing up. And marriages do evolve. And some marriages are at their peak much later when the stresses of life, those variables, those external variables have changed, and people do grow. They grow in attachment in a way that they did not necessarily have in the previous decade of their lives. So sometimes you stay together for the kids, but then the kids leave, and then you still end up staying together because that attachment has been formed. There has been healing. And maybe what I'm saying can be somewhat soothing for people who really don't believe that their marriage could ever improve.
I'm thinking about our letter writer, and obviously we don't know any details about this person's life, but it could well be that what exists now in the marriage is not necessarily what's going to exist in the future. It could be their external stresses or internal stresses that the couple isn't even aware of, and they don't know what the reason is. And when those stresses are removed, maybe things can change naturally, even without any sort of intervention.
Exactly.
When we talk about, should I stay in the marriage or should I not stay in the marriage? That's not really our topic now. That's a much bigger concept. When it comes to Jewish sources, there's no one answer. Just coincidentally, I was talking to a friend of mine who was giving a shiur on the very Mishnah I'm about to cite from Gittin 90a, page Tzadi Amud Aleph, where Beit Shammai say a man may not divorce his wife unless she engaged in sexual misconduct. Beit Hillel say he may divorce her even if she burns his food. Rabbi Akiva says even if he found someone else he prefers. And we have 3 different opinions here about what are proper halachic grounds for divorce. Beit Shammai say it's very difficult to divorce somebody. By the way, he'll say if you divorce her anyway, it still works. This is not about whether the get is valid. That's not the question. The question is, what is a proper reason for, so to speak, to end the marriage? Beit Shammai say really very little, only if she's doing something which is really egregious. On the other hand, Beit Hillel said even if you just don't like something about her, even something stupid, she burns your food, even a stupid reason is grounds for divorce. He's not saying you should, but he said that's a legal reason why it's valid. Rabbi Akiva is even more lenient. He says there can be no grounds whatsoever. You have a perfectly fine marriage and you just feel like it because you cast your eye on somebody else. Maybe if we want to look psychologically at that, if a person is thinking like that, maybe they shouldn't be married because that person isn't ready to be married. If that person is willing to divorce somebody because he dislikes somebody else better, that shows a fundamental problem in his commitment. I don't know. What's interesting here is that even though generally in most halachic contexts we don't paskin, we don't rule like Beit Shammai, over here we sort of do. In fact, the Rambam says that a person should not divorce his first wife, I'm again using my own free translation, unless he discovers she was engaged in sexual misconduct. And he should not be quick to divorce his first wife. But the second, if he dislikes her, he may divorce her, which means that the Rambam, and this is based on the Gemara on that same page in Gittin, is suggesting that the grounds for divorce are really like Beit Shammai for the first marriage. But the grounds for divorce for a second marriage, which, again, using that quote from Sotah we said earlier at the beginning of our episode, the second marriage is not predestined, then even if you're just not happy, you can do it. I'm not sure how this translates nowadays. I'm not sure anyone really uses these grounds as psychological sources for the reasons for divorce. It's interesting, however, how Chazal, our sages, don't have one sort of answer of what are grounds for divorce. It goes everything from almost never to whenever you want, if that's what you want to do.
Right. Well, I'd like to comment on that if we can just acknowledge the male-centric approach for a moment and put that aside, because as a young woman, I remember that joke in our house about, oh, you burnt the pot. Nobody likes to hear that if your wife burns the food or salts the soup or whatever it is. But on the other hand, I think that there's something very compassionate, as usual, about Beit Hillel's approach, because Beit Shammai's approach is, it has to be really, really, really bad for you to leave. And Hillel's approach is that, no, we have divorce. It doesn't have to be that bad. If you want to get out, you can get out. And just to make this more egalitarian, I would like to say that both to men and women, that nobody needs to feel stuck from the sense that they can't. Again, this goes back to what it means to feel obligated to stay versus choosing to stay. And that there are challenges, more so for women traditionally, in terms of being less able to perhaps support themselves. And I think that that may be changing with the fact that most women are working and are able to support themselves, but not always. And so there may be a power dynamic that's keeping them in. And that's not a good situation if you're in because you are going to suffer if you try to get out. And that requires counseling and trying to figure out ways that you can get out. Because if there's emotional or physical or financial abuse, then you should not stay in the marriage and you should not have to suffer.
Okay, so let's take that line of Beit Shammai as a jumping off point. You only divorce her if there's some sexual misconduct. And that might lead us into the question of sexuality and intimacy in difficult marriages. So Talli, let me ask you, how does one navigate either a sexless marriage or a marriage where sex is not something which they're engaged in that often because of their disconnect?
Yeah, I think that that's a difficult question because, when I talk about sexuality in marriage, I often link it to emotional intimacy. And so to talk about having a marriage that doesn't have emotional intimacy and to try to figure out how to navigate sex within that kind of a marriage, I think is a little bit complex. And yet, first thing I want to say is that sometimes sex reconnects a couple. Sometimes prioritizing sex as something that married couples do, not just for pleasure or procreation, but also as something that bonds you, that might actually help the marriage. So I would not say, well, sorry, if you're just friends, you shouldn't be having sex together. I mean, you're married, and if sex together is something that you both enjoy, it's consensual, there's no reason not to do it. Then who am I to say that you shouldn't have sex? I think that what we see in most cases, though, are that these couples that are having a lot of difficulties and are choosing to stay, even though they really would prefer to divorce, but they're staying together for the kids, let's say. Sex is not usually on the table. It's really hard to have sex with somebody who you don't like, who you are not getting along with, who you don't have really any friendship with or intimacy. We know that most people want to have sex from a place of desire that gets cultivated by curiosity and spending time together and wanting to hang out. We will see issues of sexlessness in these kinds of marriages. And for some people, it's about grieving. They have to grieve that loss. I guess we're just not going to have sex. And that's really difficult. Again, especially if we're talking about Orthodox society, where there aren't a lot of options. You might have to find some physical needs in another way. For women who are in sexless marriages and they might have skin hunger, there's no touch. They need hug from their friends, hugs, or they might go for a massage. And it's harder for men. It's less accepted for men to request physical affection from their friends. I think it's very difficult to live without emotional intimacy as well as the physical intimacy. Some couples might continue to hug one another, to cuddle together at night, even if they're in difficult marriages. I've seen that as well.
Halachically, once a couple has decided to divorce, even if they're not yet divorced, they're not supposed to have sex together. That's actually a problem, halachically, once the determination to get divorced has been made, which relates to what you said before, that sex is not only for pleasure and procreation, it's also for bonding. And if they've decided we're going to undo this, then the process of bonding through sex, that's the implication, I believe, of that halakha, that it's a contradiction in terms.
Right. But I think that the couples that we're talking about are not at that stage.
Right. We're talking about couples who have not yet gotten there.
Even
Exactly.
if you say, as soon as the kids are out of the house, I know a couple that I remember sitting in the living room. We were friends. This isn't, and there was like no furniture. And I'm like, when are you going to buy furniture for the living room? She goes, nah, I'm out of this marriage as soon as the kids grow up. And they're still together.
And
So,
the kids are grown up.
the kids are grown up. There's tons of grandchildren. They're fine. Like people just they grow attached, and every marriage is different. And sometimes you're sure that your marriage will end, and it doesn't.
Okay, Talli, it's encouraging to know that a woman who was sure that her marriage was inevitably going to end apparently is still happy in her marriage many years later, long after she thought that it was not going to succeed. So, with that hopeful note, let's talk about our letter writer, someone who feels stuck in a marriage. She's not leaving, but at the same time, she knows that she married, quote unquote, the wrong person. Can you give that person some hope?
Well, I think that what I'd like to say really applies to everybody listening. We had spoken about the triangle of love, which consists of three elements in relationships: passion, intimacy, and commitment. And there's a lot of talk about what happens when there's passion but no intimacy or commitment, or when there's intimacy but no passion. And here we're talking about a situation where this woman who wrote the letter and many people who are listening to this episode value commitment. And so the commitment to stay in a marriage, even in the absence of intimacy and in the absence of passion, is also an element. Now, this is not to say that divorce should never be an option. Obviously, divorce is an option for all the reasons that we mentioned before. Divorce is an important option to have, and it is often an important option to choose. And it does not mean that you have failed if you get a divorce. It may actually mean that you have succeeded to make this very painful thing happen that can help each of you go on with your lives in a more meaningful and functional way. But the thing I want to say about divorce is that it's not something that we want to hold over our partner. It's not something that we want to threaten and use during times of conflict. If you want to talk about divorce, this is what I often tell couples. I'll talk to you about divorce when you're both in your wise minds and you're relaxed and able to talk about it in a kind of reflective way. But when I get these WhatsApps sometimes from couples when they're having a fight and they're threatening divorce, I usually say there's no chokhmah in talking about divorce when you are angry. Divorce is something you want to talk about when you are calm, and you can talk about the reasons in a calm way. And even the divorce process is a process and it takes time. And if it can be done with integrity, with compassion, with mutual respect, with acknowledgement of the marriage and of the good parts of each other and what you did have and what you weren't able to have, then that's the best way to do it. And in a way, some of those same principles of compassionate divorce can be applied to this idea of staying in your marriage. But when divorce feels like it's not the right choice to make, you are then making the choice to be committed to the marriage. And while commitment is only one element, it's very possible and even likely that through the act of commitment, the other elements can be strengthened over time.
So you're saying, if I understand properly, just to paraphrase, that the commitment corner of the triangle, that commitment, if that remains strong, then it can enhance the passion and intimacy and cause them to exist where perhaps they before were absent.
Yeah, well, commitment can create shared values. Commitment can be to making sure that the kids grow up in a healthy home. It can be making a commitment to not have certain types of fights in front of the kids in order that they feel that they're growing up in a stable environment. Commitment to religious practice, commitment to fun activities, vacations, family life, playing games together on Friday nights. There are many, many ways to use commitment, to value commitment in the marriage, in the family, and that through those committed acts, the intimacy can be strengthened over time.
Then I'm not the therapist and I don't want to pretend that I am, but it almost sounds like, and I guess we'll conclude with this point, that maybe some of it might even involve a bit of reframing. Instead of thinking I'm stuck in this marriage, I'm committed to this marriage. If I'm stuck, that's something that's happening to me. if I commit myself to this marriage and staying inside, that's a choice that I'm making. And perhaps that can help the person then gain those additional possibilities, the possibility of regaining intimacy. Is that true?
Exactly. Yeah, it is. There's a shift in focus here. And if the focus has been, I married the wrong person, we can shift it to, how can I improve my ability to love this person, even with his flaws? And to recognize that you also have flaws and you're not easy to live with either. I know I'm not. Really, any partner needs to realize what it's like for, every person
I'm
needs
a
to
piece of
realize.
cake, Talli, I have to
Yeah,
tell
I'm
you,
sure. Yeah. Well, I am not. And I have someone in the other room who can come in here and attest. Okay. We're not all easy to live with. We all have our stuff. And again, I'm not devaluing marriages that are difficult and painful and sad. And we have to be in that. We have to be in that. We have to allow ourselves to be in that sadness, to be in that grief, and also to value the moments, even if they are just moments of connection, of friendship, of, sharing a joke, of making it work, acknowledging that we're not here because we want to be. We're not here lechatchila. We do have problems. We don't feel attached and connected. Maybe we will get divorced in a few years. Like, we don't want to shove things under the rug. We want to acknowledge what really is. But that doesn't mean we can't make the most of what really is.
Okay, that sounds good to me. All right, thank you for this episode. Thank you all for listening to our latest episode of Intimate Judaism. Remember to go to intimatejudaism.com, subscribe to the podcast, rate and review, and share with your friends. Thank you for listening.
Bye.